It is now time for the Robesonian Sports Report with Chris Stiles on 97.1 FM, 1340 AM, WAGR in Lumberton, covering sports for Robeson County. Now here's your host, Chris Stiles.
And welcome to the Robesonian Sports Report here on WAGR. I'm Chris Stiles, sports editor at the Robesonian, and here for a 30-minute look at last week's high school sports in the area, particularly high school football, and as well as looking ahead to this week's games. And then we'll have a special interview segment as well. And looking back at Week 6 of high school football locally, St. Paul's earned a 20-13 win over Charlotte Latin. Cape Fear beat Purnell Sweat 36-14. Jack Britt beat Lumberton 49-8. Red Springs and Fairmont each had their bye weeks ahead of the start of conference play. And UNCP beat West Liberty at the collegiate ranks locally by a 37-19 score. So looking at St. Paul's and Charlotte Latin, this was one of the few games in the area that did not move off of Friday night. They did move it up to a 4:30 kickoff. The first half was kind of a sprinkle here and there, a little bit breezy, but pretty benign conditions compared to once the second half started. It started to rain a little more heavily. The wind got heavier. And it was at times later in that game kind of blowing sideways 45 degrees from this was effects of Tropical Storm Ophelia. And so certainly tough conditions and kind of progressively deteriorating conditions as that game went on into the late afternoon and early evening on Friday. But that's good conditions to run the football, and that's something that St. Paul's has done well the last few years. Been kind of up and down in the run game here to start this season, but they ran the ball very well Friday night. I believe it was over 280 yards of rushing offense, and that's so a return to one of their program staples. With that, Coach Mike Setzer said, kind of channeled Thomas Edison and said, we're trying to find what works, and pardon the pun, but the light bulb went off on the rushing game, and also on their defense, allowing just 13 points to the Hawks in that game. Joshua McBride rushed for 150 yards, had a 75-yard touchdown run in that game. This is a kid that he's a sophomore, was kind of thought of as the heir apparent to Kamarian Baldwin after the three-time county Heisman graduated. And just like for the entire team, it's been up and down for McBride as well, but he had an excellent night on Friday. So the Bulldogs enter conference play at 2-3 overall, but they're on a 2-game winning streak after beating West Columbus and Charlotte Latin their last 2 times out. And St. Paul's has Red Springs coming up this week. We'll talk about that a little later on in the show. Cape Fear won 36-14 in Pembroke over Purnell Sweat. That was the first loss of the season for the Rams, who are 4-1 overall, 1-1 in the United 8 Conference. Pretty dominant night on both sides of the ball. That game was on Thursday night for Cape Fear. They led 18-0. The Colts did at halftime, led 36-0 before 2 late touchdowns by Purnell Sweat. This is one of those games that the better team just took care of business, if you will. One positive for Purnell Sweat, maybe a little bit of momentum for them, for lack of a better way to put it, coming off of a couple of late touchdowns in that game to make it 36-14. Not getting shut out can help with confidence, etc. As opposed to if they put a 0 on the board, what would that have done to the team's confidence moving forward? Fortunately for the Rams, we won't have to find out. Raymond Cummings found Lakota Locklear for a touchdown pass, and it was a long run as well by Aiden Dial to score a touchdown in that game in the fourth quarter. Purnell Sweat's at Jack Britt this week, and once again, we'll talk about that one coming up. You're all listening to the Robesonian Sports Report here on WAGR. I'm your host, Chris Stiles, and we're talking about Week 6 high school football games here locally. And Jack Britt played Lumberton on Thursday night, and the Buccaneers came to town and earned a 49-8 win over the Pirates. This game was 22-0 at halftime. Coach Dennis McFadden for Lumberton said this game actually kind of was more competitive than maybe what the score would indicate, and eventually kind of, quote-unquote, got away from us. But, we've talked about it. They're struggling to just get by with all the attrition that team has had through injuries, through players opting out, etc. And I have a quote here written down from McFadden. He said, quote, "making sure to compete with what we have and try not to suffer any more injuries." So staying healthy at this point is really their top priority, as it is for every team, but especially in their situation. McFadden praised Michael Pitts and Isaiah Gomez both for stepping in at the quarterback position with the starter Trayvon Moore going down with an injury. And he said the team is still in very positive spirits here halfway through the season despite the situation, 0-5. And, of course, they did have a couple of close losses out of those 5, so showed certainly that it is possible for them to get in the win column at some point this season if they can play to their best capability in the right situation. Red Springs and Fairmont had byes this past week. Red Springs is at St. Paul's and Fairmont's at Midway this Friday to open up Southeastern Athletic Conference play. And then collegiately, UNCP earned its second win of the season, its first conference win, with a 37-19 win over West Liberty. It's kind of an interesting factoid. The winning team in every UNCP game the last 3 weeks has had 37 points exactly, strangely enough. But this was a dominant win for UNCP over a struggling West Liberty team that has not won a game this fall. The stats aren't really eye-popping for UNCP, more of just a day that they went out there and took care of business, did what they had to do, and the scoreboard reflects that maybe more so than the stat column. Of course, that's where it's important anyway. Running back Sincere Baines had a breakout performance with nearly 100 yards on the ground, 1 touchdown run for him as well. He's a Jack Britt graduate who's a freshman for the Braves. And then wide receiver Diaz Alexander had 74 receiving yards, so kind of a breakout for him as well. Sean Hill had a big play on defense with a interception return for a touchdown, and he had 6 tackles as well. The Braves will have Wheeling University coming to Grace P. Johnson Stadium this Saturday for a noon kickoff. And you can read about all of those games, the games from last week on Robesonian.com, as well as previews for this coming week, a predictions column, etc. And that's, of course, Robesonian.com, your home for all things local sports at the Robesonian. Just getting started here on the Robesonian Sports Report. On the other side of the break, we'll have Jonathan Bim, the former sports editor at the Robesonian, joining us over the phone. This is WAGR. Back on the Robesonian Sports Report and doing something a little different for our interview segment this week. We've got somebody who is no stranger to the Robesonian Sports Department. Former Robesonian Sports editor Jonathan Bim joins us over the phone. How's it going?
Pretty good, Chris. How about you?
Pretty good. So, yeah, you spent...
Good to be back on the airwaves.
Yeah.
For sure. So.
Yep. And you spent, I believe it was 9 years of your life here in Robeson County between graduating from UNCP and then 5 years as Robesonian sports editor. So, you know what? Obviously, this is a special place to you.
Yeah, it is. I think about it when I was there in the Robesonian. I was like, man, half my life has been spent there. Met my wife there. A lot of good times. I still go down there a lot. I'm a proud UNCP alum. So now I'm not covering them as much. It's also good to sort of get to be an alum and just to be a fan of the programs that happen. And so that's kind of cool to step back and see that a little bit. And there's still a lot of overlaps that sort of sometimes come being here in Moore County now. Just crazy to see people that I knew from back then and just teams and coaches and people in athletics and UNCP. It all crosses over somehow.
Yep. And describe what you're doing now, obviously, at the Pilot in Southern Pines.
Yeah, so I cover sports as well. Still here. There's a couple more obligations here. I'm enjoying my time at the Pilot. We're a award-winning newspaper, one of the best in the state. So it's good to be here in this newsroom and doing what I do and bringing the coverage that I think was missing to Moore County. It's what I learned while I was at Robesonian. It was covering everybody equally. It didn't matter what school, what sport. You got out there if it was a Tuesday volleyball game or a Wednesday soccer game, Thursday tennis match, and then a Friday football game. No matter if it was Lumberton, formerly South Rob, or Red Springs or Fairmont, you went out to those matches and contests. So that's what I've tried to bring here. We've only got 3 high schools, thankfully, or else I'd be everywhere every night. So this is what I've been doing here for the last 3 years, because Labor Day was 3 years for me here in Moore County.
Yeah. And that was a return home for you as well, right? Yeah,
I grew up in northern Moore County. I'm in southern part of the county right now in Southern Pines. getting to live the dream a little bit here. Find out that city life isn't quite how I like it. I'm hoping I can get out of it here sometime soon, especially here in an apartment. But rent and mortgages are just terrible all around. That's a whole other discussion. But, yeah, and I get to cover some cool things that come through. Golf is a big thing here, which I think me and you've played golf several times, hundreds of times, and it's just something we enjoy to do.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good segue, actually. You've got a big event coming up next year that you guys will have a very extensive coverage of with the U.S. Open at Pinehurst No. 2.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. 2 years ago, I guess last summer was we had the U.S. Women's Open at Pine Hills, which was a good tester just to get a feel for what's going on, how we run the things. We're a twice-weekly print paper, Wednesday and Sunday, but we go out and print a daily tabloid paper with a very talented golf staff that come into town. So looking forward to that next summer. Obviously, I watch golf, keep up with golf, so that's something to see the PGA Tour, those pros, and the Live Golf guys come if they qualify in. So that's going to be something exciting. But, yeah, it's something that impacts the whole region, I've learned. And you come here and I cover golf and everything, but there's been so many stories that aren't necessarily about golf, but they relate to golf. Such as the USGA is going to be putting a second headquarters here, and their plans for what they do with golf and how it just. And I've talked with so many people, even people from back from Robeson County. It's funny to see how, I'm going to make sure I'm become a volunteer, or I'm going to get some tickets to go up there and see those guys play. It's something to behold how it just affects not just Moore County, not just Pinehurst, but the whole region.
Yeah. And it is a Ryder Cup week as well, so golf in the headlines. So. Quickly, what's kind of your take on who might win the Ryder Cup this weekend?
Let's see. I think we were talking about this weekend. Just I would be fine with a tie, just that way it retains with the U.S. I think Europe's always tough to beat in Europe, and I don't think the U.S. team is the guys they've got on their their caliber they were 2 years ago. So I'd say Europe takes the cup back.
Yep. Yeah, after the Solheim Cup, which is the women's Ryder Cup equivalent, Europe won with a tie because they retained the cup having won it 2 years ago. And on the American side, kind of complaining about that. But I said, well, in 7 days, we might be very thankful for that rule if the American men can retain the Ryder Cup that way. But and one more question for you about the pilot. I know there's a couple of other Robesonian alums that are there, if you will.
Well, actually, I'm the only one still here. We've had a couple. Actually, I guess Abby Overvelt used to work in the news side. She covered a lot of crime and stuff probably about 8 or 10 years ago. She's up here with me. We've had Jamie Baxley, who was a general assignment reporter at the Robesonian. He came here. He actually was my connection into the newsroom here. How I got the job, I would say I credit him. He's now since moved on to NC Health News. And Mary Kate Murphy, who was a Champion Media Laurinburg Exchange reporter, and she's now moved on with a personal, just moving to upstate New York or upstate Virginia. So it's been a cool little training ground down in Robeson County. Everybody doesn't realize it's a good training ground for reporters to get their feet wet and a lot of different things to keep moving on.
Yep. Here on the Robesonian Sports Report, I'm your host, Chris Stiles. I'm with a literal friend of the program in every sense, Jonathan Bim, the former sports editor at the Robesonian. It's Red Springs and St. Paul's this week here in Robeson County. I'm not going to ask you to weigh in on teams you haven't covered this season, but what are some of your rivalry game memories here in Robeson County, whether it be that one, whether it be Purnell Sweat, Lumberton, or some of the other ones?
Oh, there was actually I was talking with Chris Chapman. He was the trainer at Red Springs. He's now the trainer at Union Pines. And every time we're on the sidelines at Union Pines, we're talking about what happened back then. We always say, "You remember when?" I remember Red Springs Fairmont was always at its fever pitch. I think it was at its fever pitch around 2016 to 2019. And I think there was a game where Red Springs won in overtime. Jay Sean Carson's on a running back pass, which was sort of a trademark for Coach Lawrence Ches at Red Springs, winning that game. And then there was the next year that Fairmont goes to Red Springs, and the bus rolls up 5 minutes before kickoff for Fairmont. And we're sitting there wondering if they're even going to play the game. I think it was moved up because to a Thursday because of rain. And I remember them getting off the bus. Jordan Waters was the quarterback then. Now at Duke is a running back. And it was just something. I think that was his game where everybody talks about the Heisman moment for any kind of sport, but especially for football. But that was his Robinson County Heisman moment. I think he just took over the ball game. He was not going to be stopped. Fairmont walks in the stadium as the horn sounds for pregame, and then they go out and beat Red Springs. So that was a good rivalry matchup. Obviously, anytime Fairmont had a in-county game in basketball, those were always good too. You get to a packed gym. It was really hot in there, and it was just a lot of fun to be had.
Yeah, and Fairmont Red Springs coming up here in the coming weeks as well. And you mentioned Jordan Waters at Fairmont. What was it like to cover him, and did you see that potential for what he's doing now at Duke, having scored, I think it's multiple touchdowns in 3 straight games?
I thought so. I thought basically genetically. I mean, everybody talks about his cousin, what he was able to do, Darius Leonard, what he was able to do across the border at Lakeview and then go to South Carolina State and then go to the NFL. I thought it was in his genes, really. I thought all it took was a chance. So he was one of those guys. I came in the Robesonian in October 2015. He was a freshman at Fairmont. I remember them talking about, he's going to be the future. Obviously, there was Jerick Moore, a very talented quarterback, and Julius Calder. And I remember Jordan was one of those guys that just stood out as a freshman. And he had to transform. Obviously, there wasn't as much of a quarterback for him after Julius graduated. So he had to be an athlete. He had to basically take direct snaps and run the ball and do what he could. And he's one of the best guys I've covered as a person, as a player. Always friendly, always had a smile on his face. It's good to see good guys having good things happen to them.
Yeah, second and right here. And UNCP football, a new era there with Mark Hall taking over. You mentioned that you keep following UNCP athletics as an alum. So what have you kind of seen from the Braves so far, 4 games in under Coach Hall? Yeah,
so I think it was one of those things I didn't really know a ton about Coach Hall when he was at Chowan before until I sat down at that the Two Rivers Classic coaches show at Wing Company, and I was the moderator for that coaches show, and I didn't really know about all the trickery and all this stuff and all the different variables he brings. And so I think it's a fresh start for the program. I mean, 2-2 right now. Obviously, you've taken 2 tough losses. The Mountain East is a very tough football conference. Charleston's going to be a tough team to beat. There's a couple more games ahead for them, but I think they're in the right direction. Obviously, they bring in a lot of guys that are familiar with his program, his style. Bring in some young guys too. I thought one of our guys here that graduated from Pinecrest, Ralston Barber, is a backup right guard for the team, and I was asking him about what he likes. He's just like, it's just a cool environment. He says that the offensive playbook's a little tough for him. I think he said there was one play that literally you can read the description of the play, and it's like a whole paragraph. And he's looking as a right guard. He just looks for 2 words to figure out what his blocking scheme is going to be. So I think that's something. It's a very mental, intellectual offense and what they are able to do. But once they get these guys acclimated to it, I think there's a lot of possibilities for the Braves on the football field.
Yep. And on the basketball court, strong season last year for UNCP, the last couple of years, and nearly everybody back from that team last year. So what do you see from that team going into the winter?
Yeah, so obviously we've seen the program. I've seen it from its ebbs and flows for the last, I guess, 2011, 2012. We're coming up on 12 years of me seeing UNCP basketball. And it's been awesome to see what's happened the last 8 or so years, what they've been able to do. So I think it's a program. I think they need the last year. They were very young to get acclimated, get their feet wet. Obviously, it didn't come with the conference tournament championship. It didn't come with a win in the NCAA tournament. So I think that's going to have them come back hungry, a lot of those guys. And they just continue to recruit really good talent. So I think they're going to rebound hard. They're going to run the floor. They're going to defend well, and I expect this team to do a little bit more than what last year did.
Yeah, and you covered Bradley Haskell, the starting point guard, as a senior in high school at Pinecrest there in Southern Pines area. So tell me about covering him in high school and his role with the Braves now and moving forward.
Yes, I think he came on my radar, I guess, his sophomore year. I think because obviously Pinecrest was in the Lumberton Purnell Sweat Conference. And I want to say he might have dropped 40-ish points against Lumberton or something on the road in Southern Pines as a sophomore. And I was like, okay. I think he started getting some D1 attention and whatnot, but he ended up sticking with the Braves after his recruiting journey. And so I think it's been cool to see him go from I saw him his senior year because I came into that weird COVID year. Yeah. That was right after Lumberton beat Pinecrest. That was my last game at the Robesonian, was Lumberton beating Pinecrest in Fayetteville in the 4A East Regional Final. And so I saw his final game of his junior year, and I got to see his whole senior year. And he was, just a smart, intellectual guy. And then when he was recruited, I was thinking he had the UNCP offer, but I kept sort of in the ear of people. I'm like, UNCP's perfect for him. He's a rebounding point guard, a guy that's going to get it done, very smart, going to defend. And I thought it just when it fell through, I was like, I think it's going to work out the best for him. I think he's really grown the last 2 years, really. I think I've seen him grow out on the court. I think he's had a kid and all this stuff, and I think he's really become a very mature player, very mature person.
Yeah. And you mentioned Lumberton's run to what became a co-state championship in basketball, as the state championship game was canceled due to COVID the week it hit. But that was just such a magical run. You and I both covered that. What are some of your memories from that run and such a great accomplishment that the Pirates made that year?
Yeah, I think it was because when you look back at how it was a first-year coach, I mean, obviously we knew of Brian Edwards at South Columbus, and when he comes into the program, okay, we'll see what he brings in. To see what he was able to do with a talented group like that, it really opened my eyes. And I think we were sort of not sure. I mean, obviously he played so open with South Central at home, who was the defending 4A state champs, and we're like, we're not sure how this is going to go. They beat that team, and then they were on the road the rest of the way, and it was just road warrior, road mentality. And I think after the Garner game, is that the one you went to up in Garner?
Yes.
Yeah, I think after that we said, okay, this is really a possibility. I think it was one of those, okay, obviously that players and guys were taking it one game at a time, but then when they got past Garner, we were like, okay, this team has got the capability. They've got the pieces in place, and that was really cool to see a group really from seniors to freshmen on that team really helped out, really led that team. And then they carried it into the regional final the following year because they beat Pinecrest. The semifinals here in Southern Pines, I remember covering that game for you because you were sick with COVID. So, I remember that game as well because it's just something about that core nucleus of guys just knew how to play with their backs against the wall in a playoff situation. Even it was something that we see it every day that we say, okay, this team maybe cannot get it done, but we also know we're not in the program, and then it's the guys inside that locker room that really believe, and we quickly became believers as well with them along the way. Yeah. But it's really cool to see a team do that.
Yeah, 4 County Player of the Year awards among 3 players now on that team as they've all finished their high school careers. Jonathan Ben, thanks for joining us here on the Robesonian Sports Report.
Yep, thanks, Chris. Happy day.
Yep. We'll be right back. Back on the Robesonian Sports Report here on WAGR. I'm your host, Chris Stiles, sports editor at the Robesonian, and here in the last segment of the show, as we do each week, looking ahead to this week's high school football action in Robeson County. And the headliner certainly this week is Red Springs at St. Paul's in a county rivalry game. The Red Devils enter at 3-2. The Bulldogs are 2-3. And this is the conference opener for both teams. These high schools are smaller than Purnell Sweat and Lumberton, but this rivalry has just as much juice as Sweat Lumberton, which is generally considered the county's biggest rivalry. But I consider these two pretty much on level footing as far as that goes. I mentioned their records, but both teams are coming off consecutive wins. Red Springs won over Lumberton and Mullins their last 2 weeks of non-conference play before they had a bye week. St. Paul's beat West Columbus, then went through their bye week, and then beat Charlotte Latin on Friday. The run game should be key for both sides in this one. St. Paul's kind of found its run game more than probably it has all year in the win over Charlotte Latin. Red Springs has shown its capabilities on the ground quite a bit this year, and there's several talented backs on the field in this game for both sides. Both defenses have had some very strong performances. It's really kind of been the strength of the St. Paul's team this year to an extent. And Red Springs has certainly shown its strength on defense as well. Particularly their last time out held Mullins to 8 points in a 20-8 win across the state line. So Red Springs, I think, is more even with St. Paul's than maybe some people will think. Red Springs a couple of one-win seasons the last 2 years, but this is a lot different and a much improved Red Devils team. St. Paul's has gone through some growing pains this year, but turning it around the last couple of weeks. But I think this should be a pretty competitive game. And in a kind of even rivalry game, you wonder how emotions or how teams react to certain things that happen on the field. That could potentially play a role in the outcome, which team deals with that better. St. Paul's has won 5 straight in the series. Red Springs actually had won 3 of the previous 4 before that. St. Paul's won 42-0 last year, but as I said, this is a lot different Red Springs team than the one that took the field a year ago at home in this series. So this should be, I think, a really competitive game on Friday night. And you can find my predictions column on Robesonian.com, of course, for that and all the rest of the games. So looking elsewhere around the county, everybody else is on the road that's playing. Purnell Sweat is at Jack Britt. This is a big one in a couple ways for the Rams. First of all, coming off the loss for the first time this season, how are they going to respond to that? And then secondly, I think this is going to end up, as the season plays out, potentially being a pretty big one standings-wise. Jack Britt is 2-3, but they're 2-0 in the United 8. These are a couple of teams that I think the most likely scenario for them as the season plays itself out is probably kind of in that 3rd, 4th, 5th, maybe 6th range in the United 8, and this result could go a long way toward determining that for both teams. Jack Britt's 2 wins are over Douglas Byrd and Lumberton after an 0-3 start, so not necessarily the highest quality of wins, but they have clearly shown some improvement after they started the season getting shut out twice, and they've scored 49 points the last couple of weeks. Nice, decent threesome of skill players with quarterback Jackson Powell, running back Cameron Williams, and wide receiver Javante Brooks for the Buccaneers, who have won 6 straight games in the series, including a 41-8 win last year. Here on the Robesonian Sports Report on WAGR, I'm your host, Chris Stiles, sports editor at the Robesonian, looking through Week 7 of high school football. Hard to believe it's Week 7. But Lumberton's at Southview. Pirates, of course, as we mentioned earlier, winless on the season, 0-2 in league play. Southview's 4-1 overall, 1-1 in the league. That one loss came to 71st, who seems to be the best team in the United 8 once again this year. Last week, the Tigers beat Douglas Byrd 44-14. They've got a pretty prolific and balanced offense, an 800-yard rusher in Christian Rutledge, a nearly 1,000-yard passer in Tyreek Clarita, and Lumberton, of course, we've well documented their issues with attrition and depth. So it's not getting easier for them as they play another tough opponent in the United 8. Lumberton's lost 6 straight games in this series against Southview, and it was 49-0 each of the last 2 years. So another uphill climb, if you will, for the Pirates this week. Fairmont's at Midway. Fairmont is 1-4. Midway's 4-1 as they both begin conference play in the Southeastern. Fairmont, in fact, has lost 4 straight games. Midway's only loss was early on in the season. This is an eye-popping score, I warn you, an 80-58 game against James Keenan that they lost. Midway's been very offensively strong all year, scoring over 44 points a game, over 430 yards of offense per game. Trip Westbrook's thrown for over 1,100 yards and 11 touchdowns. A couple 400-yard receivers in Andre Gregory and Kamari McNeil. And Cody Ammons is a 600-yard rusher with 9 touchdowns. So they've certainly got the weapons on the offensive end. I think the defense is the strength of Fairmont's team, but that defense for the Tornadoes will be tested in this one. Midway has won each of the last 2 seasons. Only 2 meetings these 2 teams have had, actually, in their history. But it was 61-6 2 years ago, 26-0 last year. And then collegiately, UNCP returns home for a noon kick with Wheeling on Saturday. Wheeling is 3-1 overall, 2-1 in the MEC. Braves are 2-2 overall, 1-2 in the conference. And Wheeling, coming off a couple of high-scoring wins the last couple weeks, they have a balanced offense. And this is an important game for the Braves in kind of determining where they go from here. With a win, 3-2 overall, 2-2 in the conference, and a winning streak. With a loss, fall back under 500 and fall to 1-3 in the conference. So those are 2 pretty different scenarios. Even as the season's still just a third of the way through roughly for the college teams, but nonetheless a big one for them in that sense. And then a non-football storyline this week. I mentioned it last week, but the game was pushed due to the weather to this Saturday, the games I should say. The Robinson Cup, the county soccer tournament. Lumberton and St. Paul's will face off at 7 p.m. Saturday at Purnell Sweat for the championship game of that one. Lumberton has won all 3 Robinson Cups contested so far, starting in 2019. Then had a COVID year, and then they won it again 21 and 22. So they're going for 4 straight. Purnell Sweat faces Red Springs at 5 p.m. in the third-place game of that event. And you can read football previews, stories from last week, a predictions column at Robesonian.com, coverage of the Robinson Cup as well, UNCP football coverage. Volleyball and soccer is in season, plenty of coverage of that as well. And so Robesonian.com, your home for all of that locally here in Robeson County. For Paul Matthews, thanks for Jonathan Bim coming on the show, the former sports editor at the Robesonian, and I'm the current sports editor at the Robesonian, Chris Stiles, signing off here on WAGR from the Robesonian Sports Report. We'll see you next week.